Our guest on This is America and the World is immigration lawyer, asylum expert, and refugee advocate Dree Collopy. Mrs. Collopy is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, chair of its National Asylum and Refugee Liaison Committee, and author of its Asylum Primer, regarded as the manual of asylum procedures. She's partner in the D.C. law firm Benach Collopy. Will it be all right if I address you as Dree?
Yes, of course.
Dree Collopy. Oh boy, you're doing some serious and important work right now.
Thank you, yes.
I want to understand, because of all of the immigration stories and videos that we've been looking at over the last month or so, more, to understand some basic facts about asylum. Is there a kind of a universal definition of asylum and asylum seekers?
So the asylum system in the U.S., and as in many other countries, comes from the 1951 Refugee Convention with the United Nations and its protocol that later happened in 1967. And that convention defined the term refugee. And so our U.S. asylum laws embody that definition of refugee from those international conventions.
Is there a difference between the word asylum and asylum seeker and refugee? Is there a difference there?
In the United States, yes. Refugees who are resettled here in the U.S. are subject to a different process than someone who is physically in the U.S. seeking asylum. So refugees seek protection from outside the U.S., whereas asylum seekers are doing that from inside the U.S. borders. However, they do both need to meet the same legal definition of the term refugee.
Is the spirit of refugees and asylum seekers the same all over the world? Are people trying to escape from something?
Yes, exactly. It has the same humanitarian purpose of protecting people whose own governments are unable or unwilling to do so.
Okay, so when someone is seeking asylum, they're already in the country.
Yes.
Okay, and a refugee is approaching the country, is that correct?
A refugee is anyone who meets the definition of refugee. So there is some overlap. Asylum seekers may meet the same definition of refugee, but there's a separate process of resettlement of refugees that takes place from outside the U.S.
Okay. What I want to understand is people would come to any country in the world because, as you say, the government doesn't care to take care of them or won't take care of them. But usually it's more dramatic than that, right? What are some of the reasons that people flee a country and come to another country? I guess that's the question.
So people who are fleeing something called persecution, which is a very serious type of harm. It is more than harassment or discrimination or generalized crime. It is targeted violence, usually against someone or their family members. And it is also targeted because of a characteristic that is protected, such as someone's religion or their race or their nationality or their political opinion or their social group.
Why is it now that in Europe, in the last few years, and now in the United States, that this whole crisis has evolved? Can you back it up a few years, and what's going on that we should understand?
Sure. First and foremost, this is a time in the world's history where there are more forcibly displaced people than ever before.
Forcibly?
Forcibly displaced, either by war, civil strife, violence, other harm. And so because of the sheer numbers of people who are seeking protection, that's number one. That's why we're seeing kind of these crises around the world. And then the humanitarian purpose of protecting people and evaluating whether we can protect people oftentimes conflict with domestic policies and desires to kind of protect our borders, which makes sense, of course. But oftentimes domestic policies are in conflict with the humanitarian purpose of protecting people.
Is that what we're seeing now in the United States?
I believe so, yes.
Policy versus the kind of the spirit of the whole business here?
I do believe so.
Is there such a thing as, for a refugee coming in from the outside, the asylum seeker being on the inside, of lawful entry into a country, and is the word unlawful entry into the illegal or illegal? Help me understand that a little bit.
Sure. So the Refugee Convention has an article in it that basically restricts governments from penalizing people who cross borders for the purpose of seeking asylum. So the United States, as a party to the protocol and the convention, basically, by the international treaties we've signed, cannot penalize people for crossing the border. And so the view of that is that they're not crossing illegally, even if they don't have a visa.
Okay.
It is legal and it is a right to cross and seek protection in the United States.
Wow.
And our own domestic laws in the Immigration and Nationality Act says that anyone who arrives in the United States without regard to how they entered has a right to seek asylum. So my view is that they're not entering illegally, that they are legally allowed to cross because it is their right to seek asylum.
And I want to go back and underline that in red and underscore it again. So the law of the land is that anybody can come into the United States, and that is not an illegal act? Is that correct?
That is an interpretation of the law that I agree with. There are others in our government that do not agree with that.
So that's an area that's being debated right now between policymakers and people who are advocating for asylum seekers. Huh?
That's right. And right now, the current administration is criminally prosecuting people for entering illegally, in their view. And it's my view and the view of many others, including many legal scholars, that crossing the border for the purpose of seeking asylum is not an illegal entry.
How does that play out in other countries throughout the world? What are their rules? Are they debating the same things that we're debating here, this one issue?
I don't know about this specific issue. I know that many of the same debates that we're having now in our country are happening globally, but I don't know specifically to that topic.
Okay, let us take a little break and say to the folks at home, we're talking with Dree Collopy, and Dree is a partner in a law firm by the name of Benach Collopy, and she is also an expert in this area. She's been given top honors by the American Immigration Lawyers Association and has kind of written the Bible as to what are the rules about asylum seeking and so on and so forth. And we're trying to keep the conversation kind of fact-based so we understand exactly what is going on. I want to talk about the process on the other side. But this is a very important conversation. Sit tight, back on the other side with Dree. This is America and the World.
This is America and the World is brought to you by Whittle School and Studios, the U.S.-China Education Trust and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, the Republic of Haiti, the Rotendaro Family Trust, Japan, History, Hospitality, and Advanced Technology, Sharing Tomorrow, the Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy, and the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings.
Dree, I want to understand the process, and I think that's important, of a person seeking asylum. I don't want to be in any way disrespectful, but I want to kind of use a word. Is there a legitimate a candidate that comes to our shores, or are the people that come for other reasons? I don't even know how to ask the question, but I hope you can run with it.
Sure. Our asylum system recognizes that anyone in the United States has a right to seek asylum.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that everyone who seeks asylum gets asylum. They have to meet very serious legal standards, and they are not easy to meet. So to answer your question, yes, everyone has a right to seek asylum. There are, of course, people who may come and seek asylum for the wrong reasons, or other potentially making up a claim to asylum, but there are safeguards in our system to make sure that those people do not get granted asylum.
That's what I want to kind of zero in on. Do people come with paperwork, or do they just come with a story? And by a story, I don't mean to negate that, but just their own personal experience is a better way to say that.
Sure. So in order to get asylum, you have to present credible testimony, so somebody's story, and you also have to present corroborating evidence in support of your testimony.
And what would that be? What would some of that be?
It can be anything from basically documents showing your injuries, for example, if your claim is that you were persecuted and you were beaten, documentation showing you've had medical attention for those injuries. It can be anything from a witness providing a sworn affidavit. And additionally, an important part of documenting an asylum claim is what are the conditions in your home country? And is what you're claiming happened to you something that is happening in your home country and that is documented in reports and articles about the conditions there?
We, over the last few months, we'll hear El Salvador, we'll hear Guatemala, we'll hear Honduras. Are the situations there so explosive, so oppressive, that that alone is enough for people to hear the case?
So the conditions are very important and very relevant to whether someone is eligible for asylum, because a lot of your claim depends on whether your government is protecting people like you and that are similarly situated to you. But what matters for seeking asylum is your own individual circumstances and whether you personally were targeted. And so the conditions in the country alone are generally not enough. You have to show that you yourself have either been persecuted in the past or that you have what they call a well-founded fear of persecution in the future.
And is this case supposedly or actually heard in front of a judge? Is that the way it works? What is the due process here? What is the process?
Sure. So there's several ways to seek asylum. One way is called affirmative asylum, and that's for someone who comes here and they're here in the United States physically, and they want to affirmatively present an application to the U.S. government asking for asylum.
Okay.
So that's one way. Another way, that way is before the Department of Homeland Security. They have a corps of USCIS asylum officers who hear those claims in an interview setting. Another way is defensively, meaning that you're put in deportation proceedings or removal proceedings, and you're seeking asylum in defense of being removed from the United States. And those are the claims that are heard before an immigration judge.
What percentage of people who are seeking asylum are granted asylum?
On average, over the last decade or so, it's been about 20% of claims are granted.
Okay. If somebody were coming from another country other than our southern border, they would have to have plane tickets and visas and all of that stuff. So I'm going to set that aside for a minute, and or maybe forever, because the problem seems to be along our southern border. How many people come across the border seeking asylum per year? Do we have any idea?
I don't have statistics on that as far as the border, because not everyone who comes across the border is apprehended and counted, right? I can tell you that from January to March, about 90,000 people came across the border.
January to March,
of
3
this
months?
year.
So 30,000. I've read as high as 50,000, so, but thousands. So if you took the 30,000 figure and multiplied it times 12, so it would be 360,000. If you took the high number, you'd be talking about 600,000. Obviously, I think that's an okay word to use. Obviously, we cannot accept everyone, right? I mean, we just couldn't be accepting all of these people all the time.
Right.
Am I right about that? Do you
That's
agree
right.
with that?
Yes, I agree with that. But we do need to give everyone an opportunity, a meaningful opportunity, to present an asylum claim if they have one.
Okay, and then let me dial in on your use of the word meaningful. What would be a meaningful presentation in your view right now as things are happening?
Well, my view currently is that there is not a meaningful opportunity for border entrants to seek asylum, given all of the policies that are in place at this time. But a meaningful opportunity would be an opportunity to have time to present your case with evidence, with an attorney, in front of an adjudicator, a neutral adjudicator who will hear your case and give you fair process.
Most of the people coming, I guess this is a fair statement, most of the people who are coming might not speak English, huh?
That's right.
So, and we've traveled all around the world, and things get lost in translation. That's kind of a nightmare unto itself, isn't it, for a person to make a meaningful presentation?
It is, certainly. And currently, with the procedures that are in place at the border, which begin with a very brief screening, simple few questions. Do you have a fear? Do you face harm? Those questions are not being asked in other languages. And so those initial questions that allow people to enter the door to seek asylum are not even being asked many times, and oftentimes are not asked in a language that the person can understand.
How do we know that, Dree? How do we know that those questions
We know that from anecdotal evidence. This has been reported on for decades, actually, as a problem. It's not just now. We have a process called expedited removal in this country that if you're apprehended around the border and you don't have valid documents, legal documents to be here, you can be subject to a fast track removal process without a hearing before a judge. And that caused a lot of concern in the refugee and asylum advocacy community, because the concern was that we would be sending people back in this expedited process without ever having an opportunity for them to make a claim for asylum. And so these safeguards were developed, including this initial screening list of questions. And those questions are supposed to be asked by the Border Patrol officers. And if someone says, yes, I have a fear, or yes, I think I will be harmed if I go back, the inquiry stops there, and the border officer has to refer the person to an asylum officer for an initial screening interview called a credible fear interview. And that interview, if the asylum officer finds that there is a credible fear, then the person gets to go before a judge and make their whole claim for asylum.
Okay, we got a huge border.
Yes.
We got hundreds of thousands of people coming across. The border agents have to be stretched thin. Anybody going to that next phase has to be stretched thin. I want to ask one question before I go into what's been happening in the last couple of months. If a person is granted asylum in the United States, what do they get? What are the guarantees? They're not going to become a citizen, or they may sometime, but what are the guarantees if of that 20% of 360,000 might be granted asylum? What opportunity are they presented?
Sure.
That's a good way to say it.
First and foremost, they have the right to remain in the United States and to not be sent back to the hands of their persecutors. They have a right to work in the United States. They also have a right to travel in and out of the United States as an asylee. And after 1 year physically in the United States as an asylee, they can apply for permanent resident status, often called a green card.
Okay. What has been going on in the last few months that has gone so horribly wrong? Help us try to understand that, with the caveat that the story is changing every single day. And by the time our interview is on the air, it may have changed again.
Sure.
But in a broad way, what's going on that we should know about?
Sure. Broadly, what we're seeing is the refugee crisis in Central America, resulting in many women and children coming to the United States to seek protection. And as I mentioned, our own law says anyone who arrives in the United States has a right to seek asylum. And what we're seeing in response to that refugee crisis is a series of policies by the current administration to try to erect a barrier to them accessing our asylum system. And that's done in a number of ways. The zero tolerance policy that you may have heard of, in that they're prosecuting criminally anyone who comes in across the border without valid documents. They're separating children from their parents. They are detaining families and asylum seekers, and they are turning people back at the border. They're not even doing those initial screening questions that I talked about and saying things like, we don't have asylum anymore, or America is full. There's plenty of evidence on the ground that these things are happening. And so that's what's led to this crisis, is a series of policy decisions that have really erected an invisible wall to people even accessing our asylum system.
What do you think is, well, I have two questions, and we got about 3 minutes. What's fair and reasonable? What is fair and reasonable as this tragic situation keeps unfolding? What do you think is fair and reasonable? And I guess I'll also toss into that this whole immigration. That's a whole other conversation for us to have, but try to address that if you could.
Sure. What is fair and reasonable is following our own laws and allowing people true, meaningful access to seek asylum. And that's not happening right now. Fair and meaningful is allowing them to present their claim and to have a full and fair opportunity to be heard. And if they don't meet the requirements for asylum, they have to leave. If they meet the requirements for asylum, they get to stay. That's what's fair and reasonable.
But that initial crossing of the border is, as you say, according to U.S. law, is okay for them to do. And once they're here, there should be a series of steps that gives them a fair shot in presenting their case, huh?
Yes, and we already have those steps. We're just not following them.
The immigration story has divided this country, hasn't it? I guess the question that I have is, if you were to write some guidelines going forward right now, what would you have people take a look at?
That's a good question. I think, first and foremost, I would have them look at this asylum system, and is it actually working? Is it meaningfully protecting people who are bona fide refugees and deserve protection? That would be my first step, would be to go back and see, is our current system working? If not, how can we make it work better? And there's any number of other things beyond asylum that I would have people look at, but that would take all day to talk about.
But on a future program, we might gather some people together just to talk about immigration. We have a history of being open to immigration, and something seems to be gone horribly wrong at this time. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I know tireless work on behalf of so many people who need your help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dree.
Thank you.
For information about This Is America and the World, and to watch all of our programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, and look for us on Facebook and Twitter. You can listen to all of our ambassador interviews on our podcast, The Ambassador Series. It's available on our website and iTunes. This Is America and the World is brought to you by Whittle School and Studios, the U.S.-China Education Trust and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Julia Chang Block, President, the League of Arab States, the Republic of Haiti, the Rotondaro Family Trust, Japan, History, Hospitality, and Advanced Technology, Sharing Tomorrow. The Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy. And the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings.